Thank you so much for being here with me today. I'm really excited to get the opportunity to speak with you about your story and about your path into STEAM. Could you please introduce yourself and also please share your pronouns and your profession?
Sure. I'm Zach Deocadiz-Smith. I'm a senior designer at FitXR, working on the future of fitness in VR. I use here, they pronouns, and uh, yeah, I design a lot of things. I see myself as a trans member of the community. Recently, I've been going with more the term queer just because it's just the easiest term to use. I've been queer for quite a long time, came out pretty young and all that. So it's definitely been a big part of my identity and something I also try to like bring into kind of work that I do. Um, yeah, both like within like my work experience, but also like within community organizations that I'm part of as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And are there other parts of your identity that you feel like are important to recognize as well, that you feel strongly about or that you bring out in your work or bring into the spaces that you're in?
Yeah, for sure. I grew up in Hong Kong to Filipino parents, and that kind of experience has kind of been pretty important to me, especially since I've now like moved to America. Like being a third culture kid has been something that I think has really shaped the way that I've kind of seen the world. Um, just growing up surrounded by a bunch of different cultures, especially in Hong Kong, within the international community, I think is an experience that not many people have. And I'm pretty grateful for it, but it's also been something that also has been a struggle of just like figuring out, you know, what like my background really means to me, because it makes you kind of reevaluate what does your identity really mean, because it's not the same thing as the folks around you. And I think kind of like the queer identity also plays a part in that too.
Do you think that you could talk a little bit more about kind of that time in your life when you started to really understand your queerness and what that looked like for you, and how that unfolded for you?
It definitely started where I was like in a lot of spaces. I started joining a bunch of like games, and um, I think in my head I was always like, oh, like what if I was a guy? And um, so I was like, sounds like it could be interesting to try out. So I just signed up for everything as like a guy, and that was just like one way that like nobody would ever know, especially since kind of being a guy in like online games, it's kind of like often seen as like the default, which has a lot of like terrible implications. But for me, at least, it worked out in my favor, and that's like I just got to experience the world in a way that like I just generally felt more comfortable. And I didn't even really know what like being trans was at the time. It wasn't until like much later, where like I think I remember distinctly seeing like someone's YouTube videos about like transitioning. I was like, wait, this is like something that you can do. Like uh I saw a lot of like my own experience and like a lot of what those videos were talking about, and it's like, oh, there's actually kind of like a name for this feeling that like has always kind of generally been there. um and yeah, and that kind of like really resonated with me. And that was kind of around this time that I kind of came out as kind of being trans. I came out actually uh, to folks both like at school, like my friends at school, but also to folks online, because I had been like passing as a guy for quite a while, even even before knowing I was trans. And yeah, it was nobody really reacted terribly. At least amongst like my friends. So yeah, it was kind of nice being able to do that. For me, I don't think like without kind of like the support of like the internet and like the communities that I found, I probably like would not be like as comfortable with myself as I am now.
Could you talk a little bit about what your community was like growing up, whether that be family or the community that you grew up in, whatever, however you define community? What did that look like for you as you were growing up?
I'm in like the weird spot where I was definitely of the age where the internet was like really becoming a thing. So I think for me at least, there's kind of like two very distinct kind of communities. One was like the community that I was around, like in the physical world, um, in which like my school was pretty liberal. Like I came out to my classmates, it wasn't really a big deal. Like my teachers were generally supportive. My parents weren't necessarily as supportive, and like I grew up going to church and all of that. But for the most part, like uh, what really like I saw as like my community most of the time was actually the community that I found online. I found like a community there in like chat rooms and stuff like that, um, and in games where I could kind of really be anything that I wanted, and there were no kind of like expectations placed on me from there. Um, and that's actually so I actually found a gay chat room where I made like lots of friends. It was based around a gay author, and um, I don't read the gay author anymore. Looking back, his writing is actually pretty terrible. But I still talk to quite a few of the folks that I met in that chat room. We actually have a regular D&D game whenever we manage to schedule one, and I'm actually married to one of them. So
Wow, that's very cool.
yeah,
Congratulations.
thank
I love
you.
that like 21st century romance story. That's amazing. Um, and so do you feel like, your participation in those spaces as a young person, do you feel like that had any influence on your interest in going into the tech world?
Oh, definitely, yeah. I like to kind of point to a lot of my online kind of shenanigans as like the reason why like I am a designer.
Mhm.
I've mentioned it a few times, like in public spaces on the internet, that one of the things that like I can point at as being like my kind of gateway into design and code and all of that was like making my Neopets pet pages,
Mhm.
where which is really where I learned how to like do HTML and CSS. It's where I learned that like design can be a way to kind of um, express yourself, and that kind of moved into kind of social media as well, like through the MySpace era, which is where I really started to learn like HTML and CSS. So like honestly, design and kind of like the tech kind of aspect of design as well, like digitally designing, has kind of been part of my life since I was like a really young child. I started playing around with Photoshop and doing things like online when I was like 7 for Neopets. So I've always known it's something that I enjoyed doing, and it eventually turned out that, hey, this is kind of what I would love to do for my future job, and let me go to art school and take that path.
If you were to describe your profession to somebody who had never heard of it before, how would you describe it? So maybe talk a little bit about like the day-to-day work that you do, anything that you find interesting about your profession.
Sure. In terms of like the work that I do, I guess like I would the easiest way to describe it is I make things easier for people to actually use. Because a lot of times, if like you've ever had to teach anybody something, you'll probably come to realize pretty quickly that most people don't kind of like learn the same way, and you've also like there's a lot of training that's kind of required to be able to put things into terms that people actually understand. And my kind of job is kind of the interaction version of that. So basically, anytime you do something within an app, I've probably designed a system to make it so that it's easy for you to understand what's happening at every stage of the process. So it's not a confusing process for you to do. And I tend to in my kind of work history, I've worked in projects from the very, very start of things to the very end. So everything from wireframing things, so kind of drawing out kind of like what workflows look like, all the way through to making the final kind of like visual assets, and basically working with the engineers to implement what the final visual design will look like. Um, so yeah, my day to day kind of consist like I like to have a large variation of things that I do. So yeah, I can be working on everything from like creating like project briefs at the start of a project to yeah, again working with engineers, exporting assets so they can have something to put in.
Can you talk a little bit about your educational experience? The traditional and maybe the not so traditional that you've experienced in your life.
Sure. So I went to RISD for graphic design, which um, at least during my time there, it was a very pretty traditional program in that there was a lot of focus on like teaching you stuff in print and like teaching typography through print and all of that, all of which like I honestly think has made me a much better kind of like digital designer. But for a lot of the time when I was there, I was definitely fighting to like kind of every scrap of digital kind of like design I could put into my work I did. um, I would like do extra work on projects or rewrite projects and find different interpretations that would allow me to kind of like learn more skills with like coding and all of that, because it was something that I was really passionate about doing. As I mentioned, it's the whole reason I got into design in the first place. Like I took a class by one of my favorite professors, who his name's Chris Novello, and his class is called Computer Utopias, and it's all about like how do you design for a future that doesn't exist yet, and how do you treat like the computer as like a medium that like can be treated humanely and can be treated with almost like respect,
Mhm.
instead of kind of like creating all these throwaway apps that you kind of like see in a lot of like student projects. How about we think about this on a deeper level? Like, what is the future that you actually want to create
Mhm.
with what you're making? And that was actually where I got first got interested in VR. We started talking about it. It's where I made like my first VR project with a couple of my friends, which ironically, I don't know if we're allowed to swear, but the project's name is called VR.
Uh-huh.
Um, basically, we started trying to make a VR project. Then we realized how big of an undertaking that was. Like, we didn't know anything about like what would be sticky in VR. We didn't know anything about like interaction design or anything related to like spatial things in VR. So everything we started coming up with were terrible interactions. So eventually we kind of turned the project into VR. All of these interactions suck. Let's like lean into that. So it's like things like, oh, gaze based kind of like UI, like eye tracking is becoming like more and more of a cool thing in the tech industry. What if we use that so you were forced to look at an ad to close it? So you had to like physically look at an ad and like look at the cross button um, to close an ad, and like it's a bunch of like kind of dumb experiments like that. But it was a lot of fun. And I ended up doing like an independent study into VR the next year with one of my friends that I met in that class. So yeah, it basically my kind of educational career has been do the required work, and then find the things that you're really interested in and spend a lot of time on that. Um,
Could you talk a little bit about your experience as an LGBTQ plus individual within STEAM spaces? And that's acknowledging that not all STEAM spaces are homogenous. I like working in tech might be a very different space than working in arts, for example.
For
But
sure.
could you just talk about your experience a little bit?
Yeah, so I've worked mainly in tech, and I've had the great experience of like working in places that like weren't actively terrible to me because I was like trans or anything like that. I on the flip side, like I have had to like, especially as a designer who works on products and works on essentially defining what interactions people will use whenever they use your product. I currently work for a fitness company, like a VR fitness company. I used to work for a VR fitness company as well. Um, and those are things like, especially for folks who are trans, those are kind of like very big pain points for a lot of trans folk. The idea of having to think about like your body for extended periods of time when you might already have dysphoria, the idea of going into spaces that tend to be very kind of like gender separated, like the men's locker room versus the women's locker room and all of that in traditional gyms. Like it come like those kinds of things come with a lot of baggage. And like for me as a designer, where I'm kind of like trying to design experience where I want people to feel like appreciated, and I want them to feel like this is a space that they can come and um, kind of not have to like have to bring up all of that baggage just to do a workout. Like I think that's something that like I'm very very aware of in like my work now. Um, and when I was working on Supernatural, just like making sure that the kind of design decisions that we're making aren't going to be terrible for some subset of the community. And I don't think it necessarily it was even like um, it wasn't ever like very only all about the trans experience, but I think those experiences like um, also resonate with a lot of folks who are trying to get into fitness. I think it's definitely made me a better designer in that sense, in that like I understand that like the users on the other side of like whatever you're designing are actual people, and they come with a lot of different uh, kind of experiences before they even interact with your product. There's a large critique of the tech industry in that a lot of times, especially in social media kind of companies, there isn't that kind of consideration given. So yeah, it's been very important to me, at least in my practice as a designer, of being able to make sure that like those edge cases are accounted for. We're not making people feel terribly when they use something that I've designed. I think for me at least, it's something that I try to be pretty explicit about as well. I definitely don't make a secret of like making it obvious that I'm making these decisions because of X or Y reasons, especially in VR, where one of the biggest selling points of VR is that you can literally put on a headset and be transported to wherever you want to be and be whoever you want to be in that at that time. Um, I think we have to kind of like design inclusivity and kind of like almost, I don't want to call it like radical inclusivity because it shouldn't be radical. Um, but yeah, designing that inclusivity into the kind of experiences that we're making from the very beginning.
Mhm.
Um, Otherwise, you'll end up with what we see in social media now, where those considerations weren't taken into account, but that the scale, like a global scale of millions or billions of people using your product, those differences start to become like in the hundreds of thousands to millions of users, because 10% or 1%, which sounds like a really small percent of folks, once you're at the scale of like a billion users, is a massive amount of people that you're now negatively impacting. Um, and VR is definitely not there yet. But if we like, I would love to see it get there. um, but yeah, I would also love to see it get there, but not also be designed terribly.
Thinking of other community members in the LGBTQ plus community who might be interested in going to into the design field or the VR field, Um, what kinds of things would you advise them? What advice would you give to them if they were interested in going into that field?
The biggest advice that I can really kind of give to folks who are interested in design or VR, both of which are fields that like are kind of fields of making. I would definitely suggest like start making things. Um, there's a lot of like free resources that you can kind of get and start making things. For VR in particular, like learning how to use like the basics of Blender as a 3D model, which is an open source program, and kind of getting models into Unity or Unreal, both of which are game engines that like have a lot of documentation and a lot of tutorials for free online, um, and also are free to start up. You only start paying once you start of making money with it.
Mm-hmm.
So like these are tools that like are free, and I wouldn't say completely accessible to a lot of people because obviously you still need a computer that can still run um, those programs. But a lot of the times, being able to just get started making things, um, even if it starts off being 2D and you're drawing ideas out on paper, like the first step is really kind of getting those ideas out of your head and into a physical format that like people can actually see and interact with. Um, I think design is very similar in that like you have to get through all of the bad ideas before you start making stuff that's good. um, and like honestly, one of the biggest things like design school kind of gives you over like many other like liberal arts schools and all that is that there's so much dedicated time given to you just to make things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that kind of starts building up your visual library, of sorts, so you can start telling when things are wrong. Because a lot of times, especially in the design field, a lot of folks are kind of like, oh, I see my designs and I see someone else's, and I think I'm doing everything right when I'm doing my design, but it doesn't quite match up to the kind of like quality level of someone else's that I see who's doing this professionally. And a lot of the time, that's really just down to building up your visual library and doing things so many times that like you're essentially building that muscle.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for both VR and design, building the muscles of being able to make things and understanding how things are built, um, is kind of pretty important. And on the kind of like not non-skill side of things, the other really big important thing is kind of finding a community where you can start to make connections. Because I think that's definitely been, um, something that I've like had the benefit of being able to do.
Mm-hmm.
Again, like art school, everyone's making things all around you, so you don't feel out of place when you propose like your wild ideas because everyone has wild ideas. Um, and even like with the kind of like community groups or, like that I am currently in, like I'm part of the Queer Design Club,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of like a Slack group slash like community organization that's kind of bringing queer folks together in the design community, um, to kind of other groups like the IGDA Foundation that I'm also kind of volunteering with slash like, was part of one of their programs. Like being able to surround yourself with folks who like accept you for you so you can focus on doing the work, um, and folks who can also tell you when your work like is good or it's bad or it needs improvement. Like those are all like really important things to have. And the design community is a little bit larger just because design is such a broad field, but
Mm-hmm.
even then like it's still a small world. And like if you want to kind of like, uh, keep getting hired, especially for folks who are part of the queer community or for any kind of like underrepresented like minority group. um, I don't know if this is too spicy of a take, but like it's only the straight white boys that get to fail upwards. Um, like so, the more that you can kind of make sure that you're not, like your reputation doesn't precede you in like a terrible way, the more opportunities you'll eventually get to have. There will always be other paths. um, even if you kind of like get a rejection, like it feels like the worst thing in the world when it's happening. But as long as like you keep working towards like your goal and you're actively moving towards it, eventually you're gonna get somewhere near it, or you're gonna find a goal other than that that makes more sense to you. Because sometimes you don't really know what you want. um, like I think there was definitely a period of time where I was like, oh, I want to be like a product designer at like one of the big tech companies, and I don't think that's necessarily like I'm not going to say like absolutely not. But for me, I think like being able to make the impact that I've had at like smaller companies has definitely been a much faster and much more enjoyable way of growing.